Paul, que está detrás de la cámara. Gracias, Paul, por venir, por estar con nosotros a estas horas tan intempestivas. Paul no solamente es médico y además es doctor en cirugía por la Universidad de Stanford, sino que además tiene un doctorado en informática teórica, en física teórica por la Universidad de Toronto. Si os dais cuenta, bueno, desde luego tiene una línea de investigación desarrollada clarísima, ¿no? Con numerosas publicaciones que podéis ver todos fácilmente en Internet, pero destaca por este interés, ¿no? que justo es la línea de trabajo que queremos presentar en esta jornada, ¿no? Y es la innovación tecnológica. La idea de desarrollo y de traslación de la ciencia a la aplicación cotidiana, ¿no? Entonces, en este sentido, ahora mismo es el director general de Applied Cognition, que es una empresa de biotecnología que tiene diferentes plataformas bueno, de gestión de la salud mental, bueno, en concreto para enfermedades neurodegenerativas, pero también para pone descubrimiento terapéutico, ¿no? Yo creo que Paul ahora nos lo va a terminar de explicar en qué consiste su empresa. Pero fijaros que una de las cosas en las que ha destacado en su línea de trabajo a lo largo de los años ha sido en el uso de biomarcadores, pero fijaros, biomarcadores digitales, ¿no? Esto que os decíamos hace un momento, ¿no? La idea de conexión entre la neurociencia, conexión entre la biología, la medicina, con la tecnología, la inteligencia artificial y cómo podemos hacer uso de todas estas cosas para mejorar no solamente la predicción de lo que viene por delante, de cómo va a ser este desarrollo, sino también mejorar la calidad de vida de las personas, ¿no? Que realmente es el objetivo final que tenemos la mayoría de los que estamos aquí, ¿verdad? Bueno, y sin mucho más, ¿no? Sí. La verdad es que la neurociencia es su línea base y, bueno, pues nos lo va a contar él en esta charla.
Efectivamente, bueno, Nacho de Ramón ha sido quien hasta ahora se ha puesto en contacto con él, el que nos ha facilitado este contacto. Así que, bueno, queremos también que podáis ir conociendo a Nacho y
que le vais a ver a lo largo de toda la jornada.
Efectivamente, va a ser como un hilo conductor a lo largo de toda esta jornada. Y bueno,
cuando tú quieras,
cuando
Nacho.
tú quieras.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a todos.
Paul.
Y esperamos que lo disfrutéis.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Nacho.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for being here with us today. You know that we are looking forward to your presentation about digital biomarkers. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Let me share my presentation. And I apologize, it'll be in English. My Spanish is not so fluid and fluent. So hopefully English works for everybody. So I thank you, Nacho. Nacho asked me to give a talk at your conference on digital biomarkers, something that I've been very passionate about for many years now. Quick disclosure, I am the founder of MindStrong and I own stock in the company. And I'm also Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Applied Cognition and own stock in that company and receive cash compensation. Digital biomarkers and brain health has been a major focus for me for many years now, and for my last two companies, both MindStrong and Applied Cognition. When we think about the brain and the complexity of the brain, what stands out very clearly is how difficult it is to measure accurately and objectively, make an assessment of brain function. I think we have, very good, clear neuroimaging techniques. We can identify very clear pathological lesions, organic and anatomical lesions of the brain. But when we move beyond the anatomical pathology and really start to look at the functional pathology of the brain, we're very much at a loss with the instruments that we have today. And that's going to be the focus of the presentation and the focus of, and really a big driving force for digital biomarkers and what they, what they currently can do and the promise that they bring. If we look at mental health in particular, and this was the topic of my company, MindStrong, what stands out with mental health is that when you look at serious mental illnesses, and that would be bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or a major depression, these are chronic disorders. When you get diagnosed, it's not an acute disorder that gets treated and goes away. These are chronic disorders that patients have for their entire life. Typically, the diagnosis occurs in young individuals. So these diagnoses are made in people in their teenage years, early 20s, and then they live with this disease for their entire life. If you look at the graph on the right, and you look at the cumulative DALYs here is disability adjusted life years. The disorder that has the highest disability is mental health. That's that top red curve. And you see that it starts very high and the slope of it's very high. And then up to around your 50s and 60s, it continues to be the highest disability adjusted life years. By comparison, let's take a look at some of the other disorders here, chronic disorders. If we look at diabetes, for example, that's that blue one, dark blue one. Diabetes is also diagnosed early, type 1 in particular. But look at the much better much better outcomes in diabetes, much lower disability adjusted life year. That gap between mental health and diabetes, you have to ask yourself, why is that gap there, and how can we close that gap? And we're going to see the reason for why that gap is there, and it's not just specific to mental health. There are other disorders where we have gaps like that, and largely that gap exists in chronic diseases where we don't have a good way to measure and monitor disease progression, and that's the story of mental health. So again, if we look at serious mental illness, here in the U.S., the prevalence of the disease is significant. We have 11 million Americans. Our management is poor. 1/3 of these patients do not get any mental health care in a 12-month period, and it's not for lack of spending. So we absolutely spend a lot of money in that disorder. Despite the money we spend, we have poor results, and the poor outcomes are driven by lack of measurement. And that is at the heart of that gap between a disorder like mental health and a disorder like diabetes, where we have very good measurements today and we can manage these diabetes very effectively. Without good measurements, neither the patient nor the doctor has a good way to understand or communicate to each other what's going on with the disorder. So the patient has poor visibility into their disease, and you get poor outpatient care, poor follow-up. The doctor, unfortunately, can often miss a relapse, so you get high comorbidity costs with other, especially when these disorders are comorbid with other chronic care conditions. And then, of course, a combination of both leads to a delayed diagnosis for these disorders. So how do we diagnose mental illness? Today, mental illness is diagnosed using subjective assessments. So the patient can provide an assessment, complete an assessment, PRO, or patient-reported outcomes, or the provider can complete a subjective assessment of the patient, and that's a clinical rated outcome, or the provider can do a patient history and exam. The challenge with all these approaches is that while each one of these assessments, either a PRO or a CRO, are clinically validated, they're all validated against other assessments. And all the other assessments are equally subjective. So none of them are truly rooted in ground truth. They're rooted in subjective interpretations of what is going on. So for example, here you have the PHQ-9, very standard assessment for depression, composed of 9 questions that the patient would fill out. And you can see that each one is quite subjective. It also spans a 2-week period. So it's asking the individual over the last 2 weeks how often you would rate any one of these conditions. And you not only have the subjectivity in the interpretation of the question, you also have the subjectivity around the 2-week period of recollection. So what is ground truth? Well, one way to think of ground truth is to think of chronic disorders where I think we all agree we have ground truth tests and diagnoses. And these would be heart disease, diabetes, cancer, for example, where we have a host of clinical tests, a very objective clinical tests that we use to diagnose heart disease, to measure, monitor, and manage diabetes, and or to treat cancer and monitor for recurrence. Without ground truth, both the diagnosis and treatment is largely an art. And, medicine has been an art once upon a time, many years ago. In fact, when I was training at Stanford, I'd say some, heart disease was, part art, part science. It's evolved a lot since then. I think we'd all agree that heart disease management today is all very clinically and scientifically driven. But we still have conditions like mental health, pain management's another one, where we manage chronic pain through reported scales. Here at the top right is a scale from 0 to 10, in terms of pain assessment. And another one is, of course, sleep disorders. We assess sleep disorders subjectively. Below we see the PSQI sleep quality assessment, very standard subjective patient-reported assessment for sleep. The challenge with subjective assessments, again, even in other disciplines like pain or sleep disorders, is that they can largely be ineffective and lead to poor population health. So where does this all take us? Well, our story here, or the MindStrong story, or my story, I guess, begins with 3,000 daily cell phone touches. I had been working as chief technology officer at a company, a cybersecurity company, and had realized one of the things that we were doing was we were monitoring internet activity at a very, very detailed level for cyber criminals, right? To identify networks of cyber criminals. And one of the things that we discovered through just a massive amounts of data and machine learning techniques was that these human computer interactions created a digital fingerprint, we could identify people based on their fingerprint. We could people express themselves differently, and there was it was a very interesting finding. When we sold that company and I rejoined my colleagues at Stanford, I was very curious about whether this digital fingerprint that we had uncovered potentially could tell us something about brain health. So this was about 2014, 2015, so it was many years back. And this was at a time when everyone was starting to use a smartphone. We had, I think back then, we must have had 2-3 billion people, using smartphones, and leaving a very rich trail of data. And so I was very, very eager and curious to know whether this smartphone data, the digital interactions with the smartphone, could potentially give us a clue into someone's mental state. Right? Could it be a measure of cognitive function? Could it be sensitive enough to measure changes in cognition that could be influenced by changes in a person's mental state? And so after 2 years of actually self-funding research here at collaboratively with Stanford in the Bay Area, we showed that in fact you could take these measurements and we took reaction time measurements between different patterns, different keystrokes in different parts of the keyboard. And we were able to map those to neurocognitive test results. We had a psychometrician that did neurocognitive testing for all the participants in the study. We had about 150 people come through the study, and we put this app on their phone for an entire year. And the app collected all this data from their smartphone. And then we had all the neurocognitive data from our psychometrician. And what we showed was that, in fact, certain patterns and certain reaction times were correlated quite well, as you can see here on the right, with different measures of neurocognitive function. More interestingly, and recently, we've been working with a team out of University College London. They have a large referral center for FTD, frontal temporal dementia, which, as you know, is genetic. And if you have the gene, you're going to get it. And if you don't, you will not get it. Typically, it starts in their mid-40s to early 50s and starts to manifest itself as changes in cognition. And what we're seeing here is the population of patients in this study, which are enrolled, both the patients and their siblings who potentially may not have the gene, so they're not exposed to FTD. And you already start to see, even before you see changes in neurocognitive test results, you start to see changes in reaction time-based digital biomarkers. So you see here on the right at the bottom, the two distributions, the separation between the two populations, those who are not carriers versus those who are carriers, all asymptomatic at this stage. None of them with any neurocognitive test, asymptomatic in the sense of normal neurocognitive test results. And then you see the separation on the cumulative graph on the right. So this is very interesting, because it takes the early results of just being able to show that we could measure neurocognitive function in the wild with these biomarkers, almost as good as a neurocognitive test. What this shows is that collecting enough data for a long enough period of time, these biomarkers can be more sensitive than your traditional neurocognitive test results. So is this a new kind of biomarker? When we talk about digital biomarkers or digital phenotyping, and the short answer is yes, it is in many ways, because we're all very accustomed to thinking of biomarkers as fluid-based biomarkers or biopsy-based biomarkers. And how do we interpret a digital biomarker where the data from the biomarker, that makes up the biomarker, is data that's captured from interactions with digital devices. So there's been a lot written recently about how to think about digital biomarkers, how to put them in the context of biomarkers. But what's important is to understand what makes up these biomarkers, and it's largely in what the promise of these biomarkers can be, and it's largely the availability of all the data that you can capture, all the raw features that you can capture, and again in the wild, so they become very ecologic. You're measuring how someone's reacting or behaving in their day-to-day environment versus in a clinic or in a setting where they're being interviewed by a healthcare practitioner, which is a very different setting from the setting that someone goes home to and the setting that they may be in day to day. And that's a really important difference. Also, because they're longitudinal, because you can collect an enormous amount of data, you can collect daily data in many patients, they can be more sensitive. So you start to reduce the standard error in the predictions. And as you saw in the frontal temporal dementia example, you actually might, in some situations, you get predictions of changes, more sensitive predictions of changes in neurocognition than you would from standard tests. there's been some other really interesting research, and this was in many ways concurrent research with some of the early work that I did on the digital biomarkers. And I'll mention two in particular that are actually quite exciting and well known. The first is the Facebook paper that was, or Facebook. I don't think it was published by Facebook, but it was a study where they looked at people coming into the emergency room getting a diagnosis of depression, and they consented, as part of the study, they consented everyone coming through to allow them to review their Facebook posts for the past 3 months, and they were able to take those posts. And so they had people that came in and were diagnosed, people that came in were fine, were not diagnosed. So they had a control group. And using the Facebook posts for the last 3 months, they were able to develop incredible accuracy of predicting the emergency department diagnosis of depression, which is very interesting, because if you think of taking Facebook data that anyone could be exposed to, and in particular that Facebook has, and you can now suddenly go through all that data and start making diagnosis of depression in your users, and potentially what else could you potentially diagnose from that data. It does, of course, raise some ethical questions. So there's the good in terms of being able to get to an early diagnosis for someone who's potentially depressed, and being able to get help to them. And then there's, of course, the darker side of could this be misused in some way. And then the other interesting study that I really enjoyed was one from a colleague in Germany, Dr. Christian Montag, and he showed that that smartphone usage, or the frequency of Facebook use on a smartphone, was negatively correlated with the size of the nucleus accumbens. And that was really interesting from the perspective of the nucleus accumbens, part of the reward center of the brain, and that Facebook and smartphone use of your Facebook page was correlated with the reward center, with the size of the reward center. So some very interesting results in really starting to look at digital biomarkers from a very clinical perspective. So what makes up, what is ultimately, when we think of digital biomarkers, how do we use them to improve health, and mental health or health in general? And the opportunity of digital biomarkers versus traditional biomarkers, and in particular for disorders, chronic disorders like mental health, where, like, as I mentioned, we have no objective assessments. First is to be able to get to an objective assessment. Can we get to that objective ground truth? The second is ecologic validity, the ability to not just measure objectively, but to be able to measure objectively in someone's own home environment or daily environment, and versus in a clinic, in a hospital, in some other setting. That is very important when we look at the variability in outcomes from a test. Blood pressure is a classic example. I mean, I think we've all heard about the white coat syndrome. Someone's blood pressure is normal until they have the doctor take it, and then it's high. And it's the same thing when we look at mental health, and it's the same thing when we look at a lot of the brain health and brain disorders, that they manifest themselves very differently at home versus when they're with a doctor. And then the third really gets to healthcare, and this was at the crux of what we did at Mindstrong, and that is around remote monitoring, and no more. I mean, the importance of this cannot be underemphasized, coming out of 2 years of COVID, where so much health was dependent on remote healthcare and remote assessments versus in-person patient assessments. So the ability to be able to both have an objective measurement one that allows you to see how someone's performing in their own environment, ecologic validity, and to be able to do this all remotely and be able to get that data remotely so that you can have that discussion with a patient and manage that individual remotely is really in many ways transformative to healthcare. And it's going to be digital biomarkers, and it's going to be these kinds of, both digital biomarkers and device-based biomarkers that can be potentially packaged in medical grade wearables that are going to truly transform how we deliver care. Of course, with digital biomarkers, as I mentioned, there's a host of ethical considerations. In particular, thinking back of the study with the Facebook posts, and what could Facebook do with that kind of data, and potentially what other disorders could potentially be diagnosed using Facebook. And there are other examples. There's the Walmart example where they started to send a teenage girl unknowingly, basically promotions for a new baby, and the parents were a little confused, and it turned out she was actually pregnant. So they knew based on her searches and her buying patterns. So there's definitely a ethical concern around this. Here in the U.S., fortunately, so we looked at this and several teams, and there's protections in place, but potentially more should be put in place. But some of the questions that people are asking and that we're asking is, should the custodian of this data, for example, Facebook, should they be governed by HIPAA, which for us ensures protection of private health information? What other safe harbors and boundaries should we put in place for these digital biomarkers? There's also the ACA and the ADA framework for health and disabilities, and these are both ethical and legal frameworks that absolutely limit the ability of insurance carriers both to either adjust or deny coverage based on information that they could collect from digital biomarkers. But these are concerns. These are, as we start to make these digital biomarkers more mainstream and start to use them more in managing patients, these concerns will continue to grow. Some other applications of digital biomarkers are in drug discovery, and we're seeing more of that. This was a study that we were involved in. We were supporting a drug company through a phase 2 clinical trial. It was a new small molecule to treat depression. Turns out the primary endpoint was the MADRS and SHAPS, and at 8 weeks, the drug showed absolutely no difference, no effect versus placebo. And you can see the top two charts there in terms of the placebo and the drug for either the MADRS or the SHAPS. But what was interesting, because part of the study, they had exploratory endpoints, which were all done through our digital biomarkers. So all these 100 participants had our app on their phone, and we were capturing all the reaction time measurements, and we were translating those into the various neurocognitive assessments. So you see them here, a few of them here: processing speed, working memory, visual memory, cognitive control. And what we found when we looked at that data was that, in fact, 2 of them jumped out as both significant statistically, and also their effect size was quite significant, and that was visual memory and cognitive control. So it's a really interesting example of a drug that would potentially have just been shelved, having failed to make any difference on their primary endpoint, but actually was given a new lease on life as a potentially different clinical indication because it showed effect on these other variables, these other endpoints. So these are examples of using digital biomarkers in drug discovery. And it's very, ultimately, it's almost no patient burden to add these to a clinical study. So there's a big benefit to adding digital biomarkers to a lot of these clinical studies. So one thing to think about is digital biomarkers, as I mentioned, they give you the objective measurements, that they're ecologically valid. They allow you to improve the care management through remote monitoring. But there's also an aspect of both digital biomarkers and AI that's around improving the human-to-human interaction, not replacing it. And I think that's obvious with digital biomarkers, but Tom Gruber, who's one of our scientific advisors, has spoken about he calls it humanistic AI. And the concept here is that it's not that AI is the promise of AI is not to replace the human, but to augment the human through improving interactions. And I think we'd see Mindstrong as an example, and he of course talks about Mindstrong in many of his talks on humanistic AI, where these digital biomarkers, through their sensitivity, through their ability to be remotely measuring an individual passively, so the individual doesn't have to do anything. Through that ability, it augments both the patient and the doctor in terms of their care, the care management. Another example is cognition through augmenting communication in patients with cerebral palsy or cerebrovascular accidents. And of course, I haven't spoken about applied cognition, maybe some other time. We're doing some amazing work. We're still stealth, but we're developing a very complex medical device to measure a whole new biology of the brain that has incredible promise at helping us understand, diagnose, and potentially treat a number of neurodegenerative disorders, and there are potential applications to other mental health disorders as well. So all good examples of the way we think of AI as a way to improve the human interaction in the context of patient provider. And of course, the final promise in question, will digital biomarkers lead to better patient outcomes and through improved access? Will we be able to meet patients in their journey when and where they need their care services? Will we know who needs attention when? Will the patient know? Will they be notified? Will to give them agency to seek care as well? Will care be preemptive? Can we identify a deterioration in a chronic condition like schizophrenia days before the patient ends up, disoriented in the street? Can we intervene at that point? And will all this result in better outcomes? And here, better outcomes being decreased, from one perspective, decrease emergency visits and hospital admissions. From a patient's perspective, increased community tenure and of course, increased life satisfaction and productivity. So this remains to be proven. I think we're starting to see the promise of digital biomarkers in healthcare. We're starting to see more and more companies using and developing digital biomarkers for care management, and I think we're gonna see a future where healthcare looks very different from the healthcare that we've grown up with. And that I'll thank you. I know it's presentation is a little shorter than I'd hoped, but it is late over here in California, so I hope you guys can bear with me. So thank you, Nach, and thank you everyone at the conference.